Well, a Bill Gates pet project is now set to become law imminently after passing the Senate yesterday. Our Congress working on the weekends. So U.S. Senate, which is tied Republican-Democrat, ended up passing this big Democrat piece of legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act. And as we'll get into it, you'll find it looks like this act is actually probably going to do the opposite of what its name says. Kind of like the Affordable Care Act, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act will likely increase inflation. We'll look at why that is. But the House of Representatives is now expected to vote on it later this week. We know they're going to vote yes on it because it's controlled by the Democrats, and it'll be signed into law by the president. And there you have it. Bill Gates' pet project about to become law. We're going to look at why Bill Gates is just waiting with bated breath for this legislation to become law. And we'll look at why one senator caved. There was one final senator holdout, and if she did not say yes to this bill, the bill would not pass. We'll look at why she caved and supported this massive spending bill. It's a huge climate change bill. They're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars supposedly for the climate. Also a lot of it for healthcare, aka the president's buddies in Big Pharma. Another part of the bill actually dramatically increases the size of the IRS, adding a lot of IRS agents. When you look at the breakdown, apparently the biggest group of Americans they're going to be targeting with this legion of agents is the lowest income Americans. Low income Americans can be targeted by the IRS with this bill. And we're also going to look at how they just sneaked in a ton more funding for Biden's buddies in Ukraine as well. This is ridiculous times. I'm going to wrap it up by showing how this is all reminding me everything we're going through in America right now. It just keeps reminding me of Nazi Germany, 1930s. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. See your comments. I just saw an ad saying the IRS is hiring. Oh yeah, thanks to this bill. It's not even law yet, but they know it'll become law. And they're going to have to hire a lot more agents. So we've previously covered how the IRS has an arsenal of weapons. IRS has a stock of a lot of AR-15s for some reason. Well, now they're growing their army with the help of this Bill Gates pet project. Before we get into it, shout out to the sponsor of my coverage. How about this? Noble Gold, one of the sponsors of the show, has just been picked up by Consumer Affairs, the rating agency, as the overall #1 gold IRA company in the U.S. Talk to the team today if you are thinking of precious metals, and if you're quick, they're giving away an incredible 1/10 ounce American Eagle gold proof coin with every qualifying IRA. IRA, I got IRS on the brain. Or 401k rollover. You can't go wrong with Noble Gold. Call the team now, 877-646-5347 to find out more, or visit that link down in my description, noblegoldinvestments.com, and get your free gold guide. Oh, yay. You said you can hear me loud and clear. Awesome, awesome. Let's prove to you that the Senate did indeed pass this sweeping legislation. We have video of none other than Kamala Harris making it happen. Here's the U.S. Senate yesterday.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative, and the bill, as amended, is passed.
There you go, H.R. 5376, the Inflation Reduction Act, which increases taxes and spending in our country, being celebrated by Democrats. Kamala Harris had to break the tie because our Senate currently has 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. Through reconciliation, they did not need a supermajority to get this thing passed. With a lot of legislation, you need 60 votes. They only needed 51 votes. So it was down the party line. Republicans did not want to increase taxes and spending. Democrats did. Kamala Harris broke the tie. And there you have it. This thing is going to become law because we know our House of Representatives is going to pass this thing. I mean, it's controlled by Democrats. This is the actual legislation, congress.gov, H.R. 5376, Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. I have it linked down in my description if you want to look at the text. I have not read through the whole thing, but I've read a lot of the coverage on it. But it's interesting if you look at the bill's history on its official page here. This bill was actually introduced in the House of Representatives last September. It's almost a year old that they've been trying to push it through. The bill has been amended 195 times, or at least proposed amendments 195 times. And here's the thing. This was initially called the Build Back Better Act. They had to change its name and change the narrative about it in order to get this thing passed. But this is the Build Back Better legislation. Build Back Better is, by the way, a movement amongst governments around the world. If you look at the United Kingdom, if you look at Australia, around the world, global leaders are pushing this Build Back Better idea, with largely involves climate change legislation, rearranging our entire economy. And Democrats have officially passed that global plan here in the U.S. I mean, with the Senate passing it yesterday, it's going to become law likely by the end of this week. Statement from President Joe Biden on this. You can see here, whitehouse.gov, statement from the president, passage of the Inflation Reduction Act today. He says, quote, today, Senate Democrats sided with American families over special interests, voting to lower the cost of prescription drugs, healthcare, and everyday energy costs and reduce the deficit while making the wealthiest corporations finally pay their fair share. End of quote. Repeat the line. Just kidding. But did you guys see there's actual official fact checks on Biden saying end of quote, repeat the line? Fact checkers are actually rallying to Biden's defense, which really just outs the fact checkers as being a BS machine. Literally, the fact checker, I'll bring this up right now. Social media posts misleadingly edit and misrepresent Biden remarks from teleprompter. The White House press secretary said, no, he said that stuff on purpose. End of quote, repeat the line. That was for emphasis, it literally says here. He said that for emphasis. He didn't misread his teleprompter. Anyway, Biden is thrilled. He's talking on whitehouse.gov in his statement about how he's keeping his campaign promises with this bill. And he said, quote, the House should pass this as soon as possible, and I look forward to signing it into law. Let's look at the senator who finally caved and why she caved and supported this bill when she otherwise didn't. This is kind of a dino, Democrat in name only, is kind of what we call people like Kristen Sinema or Joe Manchin. Oddly enough, Joe Manchin, this is kind of his bill, though, and it looks like he was compromised. I don't know. I want to see what Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema were paid to accept, and sign off on this bill. Were they bribed or what? But here's the thing. It looks like she kind of got her way on some issues in regards to taxes, because both she and Senator Manchin have been against increasing taxes, especially when our economy's hurting. And here, the Washington Post reports, quote, with Sinema's help, private equity firms win relief from proposed tax hikes. So she only signed off on this bill with the agreement that we're not going to slam the private equity firms with new taxes, a ton of new taxes. Now, Joe Manchin was defending this, saying, no, we're not adding new taxes. We're just closing some tax loopholes that corporations have been using to dodge taxes. We're making sure they pay 15%. So now all private equity firms will not have to pay that tax increase. Get this, quote, the last minute changes mark a significant victory for the private equity industry and an estimated savings of $35 billion over the next decade. Private equity represents a roughly $4 trillion industry in the United States. And as the sector has grown markedly over the past decade, it has flexed its considerable political muscle repeatedly in Washington, D.C. So literally a $4 trillion industry still dodged taxes with this bill, thanks to Kristen Sinema. I want to know how much that industry paid Kristen Sinema to twist the arms of everyone else to get that amended. And this is the thing. Joe Manchin was bragging about this bill being great because it was going to actually help the U.S. deficit. You know, we'll be able to pay off some of the U.S. deficit by increasing taxes, but or on closing tax loopholes, as he said. But now we're actually not going to tax nearly as many people. Now, by the way, a private equity, according to Investopia, what is private equity? Private equity is an alternative investment class that investors in it invests in or acquires private companies that are not listed on a public stock exchange. Private equity funds invest in private companies or engage in buyouts of public companies. So I guess Kristen Sinema is saying these private equity firms contain a lot of smaller businesses within them. So if you tax those guys, you're actually hurting small businesses, increasing taxes on small businesses. So that last minute amendment yesterday was supposed to help fix that. Now, we're going to get into how the IRS is being grown like crazy. But first, let's look at why Bill Gates is excited. Bill Gates wrote a whole op-ed, a special article in the New York Times written by Bill Gates on why this thing should pass. He just wrote this the other day before the Senate passed it. The headline from New York Times: Bill Gates, we're on the verge of a remarkable moment for Congress and the country. You can see the wind turbine next to a dirty factory. Bill Gates writes, turn on the evening news and it immediately becomes clear that Americans are experiencing the effects of climate change. Extreme heat and drought are affecting tens of millions of people as floods and wildfires ravage communities from Appalachia to California. In coming days, Congress has the opportunity to face the climate crisis while strengthening our country's energy security, creating opportunities for businesses and improving lives of Americans. We can't afford to miss it. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 may be the single most important piece of climate legislation in American history, he says. It represents our best chance to build an energy future that is cleaner, cheaper, and more secure. Senators Chuck Schumer of New York and Joe Manchin of West Virginia deserve a lot of credit for reaching this agreement, as do countless others. Now, Bill Gates owns Breakthrough Energy, and Breakthrough Energy has also been pushing this legislation a lot. They've been tweeting about it, writing articles, and they break down how $369 billion from this bill is going to go to climate and clean energy and basically subsidize and incentivize companies to switch everything to things like wind turbines and solar energy. This legislation, they said, would represent a massive leap forward in our transition to a clean energy economy. The $369 billion outlined for federal clean energy investments would accelerate critical climate solutions to achieve our net zero goals. Breakthrough Energy urges Congress to act swiftly and seize this once-in-a-generation opportunity to create thousands of new jobs, cut energy costs, and secure America's global leadership position in building a cleaner, healthier, more prosperous future for all. A quote from Mike Boots, Executive Vice President of Bill Gates' company, Breakthrough Energy. So, $369 billion going to completely renovating our free market economy, actually. We don't really have a free market economy anymore with these massive subsidies and government completely readjusting how goods and services are transacted. But they're saying that, even though we're kind of taking away capitalism with all this, it's supposed to be good for our environment somehow. It will make, the water, the sun less hot, it'll make the ocean go down, but the lakes, in Nevada go up, and doing this will make everything good. So, looking at Energy Wire news, historic climate bill faces state schism on clean energy. Talking about the $369 billion that they're going to be printed. Apparently our Federal Reserve, working with the Biden administration, is just printing up a storm, and I'll show you exactly how much they're printing more money for this massive legislation as they work towards 2030. It says the measure would have the greatest impact on investment in wind and solar power, which nearly doubles the $321 billion in 2030 versus $177 billion without the legislation. So by 2030, we'll have doubled our use of these, clean energy technologies, it says. According to a new report from Princeton University, the pace of yearly wind power installations could double, and solar generation could increase fivefold by 2025 to 2026 from 2020 levels, fueled by decade-long tax incentives in the act. The measure would have the greatest impact on investment in wind and solar power. So we talk a lot about how this bill has tax incentives to switch to green energy. So this comes, it's an interesting time in history because the Supreme Court has been making rulings that these Democrats don't like. I don't know if you guys saw that the Supreme Court restricted the EPA's Environmental Protection Agency's authority to mandate carbon emission restrictions. I guess this is why it was so important to Bill Gates and his buddies that Congress passed this legislation, because Supreme Court is actually taking action this year to reduce federal agencies' ability to enact massive edicts that limit our liberties when agencies like the CDC, the EPA, the FDA, we Americans did not get to elect these people to power. They get appointed at some point, and then they just run rampant and create regulations that limit our liberty with, so it's control of us without representation, without our vote. And the Supreme Court said, no. This year, the Supreme Court restricted the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to mandate carbon emission reductions. Democrats are just finding a way around it by passing the legislation they just passed yesterday. But this NPR article back in June talked about how a vote of 6-3 in the Supreme Court said that anytime an agency does something big and new, in this case addressing climate change, the regulation is presumptively invalid unless Congress has specifically authorized regulations in this sphere. So I think that's really important because, you need to have your representatives elected in your state having their say representing you in the decision on whether to enact massive changes. The fact that the EPA or FDA think that they can just pass what are in effect laws, because you get in trouble if you break them, without your representative's say, is pretty scary. So it's good to see that the Supreme Court did that, but with Democrats having as much control as they do in the House and Senate, the Democrats are getting their climate change way anyways. Now let's look at the IRS aspect of this new legislation. Jackie Heinrich from Fox News tweeted this fascinating breakdown. She tweets, Representative Kevin Brady, he says that Manchin and Schumer reconciliation bill adds $80 billion to the Internal Revenue Service, nearly 6 times the agency's current annual budget, to supercharge the IRS and unleash 87,000 new IRS enforcement agents on taxpayers, including the middle class, and not just the middle class, guys. When you look at this chart, this is incredible. So this breaks down Americans by their income level. And then on the right, you see new audits under the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. So you can see that Americans who report no total positive income, there's a lot of Americans not even working, not even reporting an income. This new legislation just passed by the Senate yesterday will now unleash over 120,000 IRS agents to audit people who don't report incomes. Okay, if you reported $1 to $25,000, meaning you're really low income, you're not making much, our government will now unleash over 300,000 IRS agents to audit you to make sure that that's what you're making, and snatch every penny they can from your low income self. Okay, if you're making $25,000 to $50,000, they're going to unleash over 140,000 IRS agents to audit you and make sure they get every tax dollar from you as they spend frivolously while you are barely scraping by, not making ends meet, probably constantly behind on your bills when you're making as little as some of these incomes listed in this chart. And then as you go up in income, they're going to unleash fewer and fewer IRS agents. You look at the 10 million mark. Well, let's face it, not a lot of people make $10 million, so they don't need as many IRS agents to audit you. So they're only unleashing 4,000 IRS agents to audit those guys who are really rolling in the dough. So that's what Jackie reported a few days ago. She updated her tweet today and said, in light of the below GOP claims, White House official points to IRS commissioner's pledge that two lawmakers that new IRS resources are, quote, designed around Treasury's directive that audit rates will not rise relative to recent years for households making under $400,000. So basically, that tells me ignore this chart. The chart's not true. According to the White House saying, no, we don't plan to audit people, people who make less than $400,000. We're not planning to audit them any more than we already do. But they are increasing the IRS dramatically, and actually Congressman Dan Crenshaw pointed this out on his Instagram today, and compared it to Border Patrol. And I know Dan Crenshaw has been getting a lot of heat as a rhino recently, but he's for the people keeping their money and getting taxed as little as possible, at least he says in this case. He brings up the point that there are only 19,000 Border Patrol agents to secure our southern border, yet Democrats have just added an additional 87,000 more IRS agents to make sure they snatch as much of our taxes as they can. It shows you where our government's priorities really are, you guys. So some of our senators tried to pass amendments last minute yesterday. Republicans who tried to pass amendments were shunned by the Democrats. The amendments to this legislation didn't go through. Ted Cruz was one of them. He wrote on his website today, Senate Democrats block Cruz amendment, insist 87,000 more IRS agents are needed to audit middle-class Americans. And like you saw in that chart, yeah, it's largely middle and lower-class people who are getting audited by this new army of IRS agents. Senate Democrats, he says, blocked Ted Cruz's amendment to the Schumer Manchin tax and spend bill to strike the $80 billion slush fund to prevent the hiring of 87,000 new IRS agents. So Ted Cruz was just saying, out of this massive bill which has so many facets to it, largely climate change facets, let's at least get rid of this weird provision for IRS agents. And Democrats were saying, absolutely not. Now, I want to show you a letter from Chuck Schumer to the Congressional Budget Office. I have linked this letter down below as well. So Senator Chuck Schumer apparently had to break down how this bill would affect the U.S. budget. Information about H.R. 5376, the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is what it was. So the Congressional Budget Office wrote a letter to Senator Chuck Schumer, making sure he knows how this bill will impact the U.S. bottom line. Are we going to increase or decrease the deficit? Because the U.S. is in a lot of debt right now. And this is why Senator Manchin was pushing this bill. When he did his media tour about the bill, he said, this bill is great because it'll reduce the deficit because we're closing tax loopholes, which will bring in more tax revenue, which will help out the U.S. budget. But if you look at the bottom of this bill, that's not true. Or this letter here, it's not true whatsoever. Letter to Senator Schumer breaks down the fact. Estimated budgetary effects of H.R. 5376. You see, every number here that's negative would be a number that is decreasing the deficit. All the positive numbers are increasing the deficit, meaning the U.S. goes further into debt with this legislation. And as you can see, there's only one negative number, and that's a -1, and the rest is all increasing the deficit. This legislation, according to the breakdown in the official congressional documentation, will indeed increase America's debt dramatically. And the biggest aspects of the legislation that will increase the deficit are having to do with the environment. There you go. So the climate change legislation is going to send us massively into debt, according to this. But I guess it'll all be worth it in order to save the world from burning down due to climate change. I don't know. I just, I looked into climate change over a decade ago, back when they called it global warming. They rebranded it to call it climate change, so they can blame any sort of climate on climate change. If you call it global warming, then you have to talk about how, the globe is warming only. But if you call it climate change, then any change in the climate can be blamed on citizens of the world using new technology, or using energy, driving their cars, heating and cooling their homes. We can't do that anymore with fossil fuels, I guess, because it's going to screw up the world and increase our temperature, which causes, the seas to rise and the polar bears to die. But the medieval warming period, you guys should Google the medieval warming period. It was a period that happened, when was that? Almost 1,000 years ago, I guess. And the people who lived in Northern Europe, where it's quite cold, actually had a very warm period in history, an extended period, year after year. It stayed very warm. It's called the medieval warming period. And they were growing crops that they couldn't otherwise grow because of how warm it was. So what happened then, because they didn't have a lot of industry, causing the globe to heat up back in medieval times, what caused that? Because as far as I can tell, when you look at things like the Ice Age, what caused the globe to cool to create the Ice Age? As far as I can tell, the climate just changes on its own sometimes. So if we're going to, create massive changes to our economy and throw out free market economics to try to make this better, I'm just worried that it's going to actually send a lot of people into poverty and suffering. But again, if you look at the legislation, the official legislation, Inflation Reduction Act, linked down in description, it was originally called the Build Back Better bill, which, Biden has talked about Build Back Better as well a lot. Now, I have pages here from the United Kingdom. The Build Back Better Business Council, established in January 2021, had brought together government and business leaders to drive economic recovery and growth across the UK, enabling the transition to a net zero economy by 2050. So the United Kingdom is passing something very similar. Then there's the Climate and Health Alliance in Australia. And Australia's government is looking at pushing Build Back Better there as well. So according to this page, it says this health crisis, the pandemic of 2020, presents an opportunity to, quote, build back better for a future of our choosing that embraces the co-benefits that can be enjoyed by transitioning to a net zero carbon way of life. So countries around the world are using this term build back better to say, basically, our economy got screwed up due to the pandemic, so let's just start fresh with something that's going to, supposedly save the climate, however that's supposed to happen. Now, John Stossel, who used to be on ABC, growing up as a kid, I used to watch him and Barbara Walters on ABC News. Anyway, John Stossel's doing his own thing now. I keep saying this is the era of independent journalism. All these people are killing it on their own. I am. John Stossel just featured how people are escaping federal taxes. See, there's so many ways to just escape taxes. And so this bill is supposed to close the tax loopholes, but there's still ways to escape it. And one way that rich people are escaping taxes is they're moving to Puerto Rico. A lot of people don't realize that you don't have to pay any federal income taxes in Puerto Rico. And I guess Puerto Rico only taxes you like 4% if you move there. So huge people, like big wealthy people. One of the people he featured was a YouTuber. It's really funny that some of the richest people are YouTubers now. It's insane. But this YouTuber was talking on a show about, I'm moving to Puerto Rico. I mean, one of the big reasons is tax breaks. And people literally saving like 25% of their income they get to keep now when they were going to be giving it to the federal government. So that's an interesting note about Puerto Rico. Reuters breaking the news today that the United States will be sending $4.5 billion to Ukraine for budget needs now. So America, aren't we nice? We're helping Ukraine with its budget as our budget goes to hell. So they're talking, Reuters reporting that this brings the total budgetary support since Russia's February invasion to $8.5 billion, the U.S. Agency for International Development said on Monday. This is more money that is just being printed because we don't just have that money. And I want to show you guys the Federal Reserve Bank's breakdown. The Federal Reserve Bank keeps track of how much money is in circulation. That's the bank that actually prints the U.S. dollars. And you can see here, fed.stlouisfed.org. Federal Reserve Bank keeping track of currency in circulation. And you can see here, these numbers are in the billions of dollars. So they are observing that currently we have $2,279 billion in circulation. Now, over the years, I'm going to expand this. You can see that the amount of money we have in circulation has dramatically increased just in the past few years. I don't know why it stretched that way, but the amounts remain the same. So I guess it was around 2011 that we had $1,000 billion in circulation, and then that was 2011. By 2020, we had $2,000 billion in circulation. You can see just since the pandemic started, how how much immensely more money is being printed. I mean, that just goes like straight up. So the Fed is just ferociously printing money, which, if you don't realize, printing money is what leads to inflation. Overprinting money. The more dollars are in circulation, the less value each dollar holds. And when I started the show, I mentioned Nazi Germany, and this is why it reminds me of Nazi Germany. There's many other aspects of Nazi Germany that we've kind of been dealing with here, but this is actually pre-Nazi Germany. It was the Weimar Republic in Germany back in the 1920s. After World War I, Germany was in trouble for their role in that war. And so the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany had to pay a lot of money to the other nations as a penalty for their role in World War I. So what the German government did is just print those dollars to pay the Allies. They weren't dollars. I guess they were, what were they? I forget what currency they had in Germany at that time. But they just printed up a storm, and inflation, hyperinflation, happened in a matter of years. I'm reading here from the Encyclopedia Britannica talking about this. By July of 2022, or sorry, July of 1922. It's funny, this is exactly a century ago, and we're going through this in our own country, not to the extreme that Germany had. I'm just hoping that what happened in Germany is not our future, that we can stop this inflation right now. But with the bill that's passing this week, we're not seeing that happen. The printing of the money is happening insanely fast. And I'm concerned that we're going to follow these footsteps. But by July of 1922, exactly a century ago, prices had risen some 700%, and hyperinflation had arrived. The government had to print million mark notes. Oh, I guess they were called marks. Those were their dollars. Then billion mark notes. By November 1923, one US dollar was equivalent to 1,000 billion or a trillion marks. A wheelbarrow full of money couldn't buy a newspaper. So what this did is the overprinting of money made everything worthless. Now all that money had, normally before that, if you had a wheelbarrow full of money, you had a lot of money. Now that money couldn't even buy a newspaper. So everyone became poor because their money became worthless. The economy was completely screwed up, and that led the way for a total reset of Germany's economy. And amid the chaos of not only that, but then the Great Depression that followed, it allowed government leaders who desired power to step in and say, I'll fix this mess for you. Just give me a little more power than I deserve. And that's what started to happen. A few different men who loved power began coming into control in Germany and enacting executive orders that were not weren't even constitutional. And before you knew it, according to the law in Germany at the time, before you knew it, Adolf Hitler was in charge. The president at the time that Adolf Hitler became into power, that president reminded me a lot of President Biden. He was very old, in his 80s, very senile. He was described as senile by the historians. It didn't seem like he really knew what was going on half the time. All Adolf Hitler had to do is become his right-hand man, schmooze him a little, and say, I'm going to fix this mess. And the president allowed Adolf Hitler to take over, get rid of the president's power, become dictator himself. And so we just don't want all that to happen in the United States. But it's just interesting to look back at Germany's history and how they printed up the storm and what that did. It sent the Germans into poverty. in the 1920s. And we don't want to do that here in the US. The more you print, the more worthless your money becomes. With that being said, I've gone over time today. I've got to run, you guys. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Oh, let me check your comments quick before I go. I always, forget to shout out super chats, guys. Super chats are so helpful and supportive. I appreciate everyone who sends a super chat. If you are so inclined to, and I will for sure read your super chats on my show, and that helps my independent journalism. If not, that's fine. I'll read some of your other chats as well as I have time. Indeed, the future is the past, you said. Well, I hope not, dude. I hope that we can, correct course here and not go down the path of Nazi journaling. Hey, thanks for the support. Thanks for calling me awesome. Thanks for everyone who tunes in and shares my show and tells people to watch, likes, comments, and subscribes. We'll see you guys